again, we don't know really how accurate the so-called objective measures are. There's belief systems that drive these things. So we have the Wabash National Study of Liberal Arts Education, and there are now 40-some institutions, I guess, involved in this, including several community colleges and so forth and so on. And Ernie Pasquarella and another group of people are leading that work, and you can read this yourself. Again, not surprised that we would find measures of student engagement to be related to the kinds of outcomes can you tell I changed the color on moral character just so that it would jump out? But let's not get too excited about it, because while it jumps out, you can I don't know what happened here to the screen, but looks good up here. You want to come up here and take a look? Critical thinking, contribution to science. You get to the third from the bottom is moral reasoning. And this is, as many of you know, the measure here is Jim Rest's defining issues test. That's what they're using as the representative measure for moral reasoning. And whether you like it or not, whether it's sufficient, just accept it for the moment. Academic challenge, the amount of reading, writing, where faculty members set expectations for student performance, number of hours students spend studying, the kinds of things that go into that measure is the check mark means there's not just a statistically significant relationship here, but it also has an effect size that's pretty strong. So academic challenge is related to higher scores, if you will, on defining issues test after the first year of college. What we have here is just pre-test measures of the kind of stuff that Sandy's been doing. I mean, they had pre-college measures of these things, and then end of first year. What is somewhat disappointing is the X, the marked out under student-faculty interaction, meaning there's a small negative relationship between students' development of moral character or moral reasoning on the defining issues test and the frequency with which they reported interacting with faculty. I think I know some of those people. Well, it's what? Well, whose presentation is this? anyway, so there's a substantial pattern of positive effects, but once you dig deeper into the kinds of things that matter, you know, when you aggregate up to a level like these NESI benchmarks, you can lose some important stuff. And so in the Wabash study, they have a measure of good teaching practices. These are the kinds of things such as, you know, does the instructor organize each class session in a way that you understand? Does the faculty member understand when you aren't following what's going on? You know, there's a host of these good teaching practices. Well, the good news is they actually work in terms of the kinds of outcomes we think are important across a bunch of measures, including moral reasoning, and there are some other measures here that I think we would say are also key to character development. And the good news is, as you unpack further in some of the other measures, like experiences with diversity, here too, there's a positive bump on moral reasoning, as well as the NESI deep learning scale, the proxy for deep learning. We didn't design, I don't think, maybe it was in Sandy's mind or Chick's mind, but it wasn't in mine. We didn't intentionally design a scale for deep learning. We didn't discover what the hell the concept was until about 5 years ago. But we said, look, I bet we've got some items that if students did these things more, they would be more likely to develop a capacity for reflective judgment and being able to synthesize and apply and so forth and so on. And so these are the kinds of questions that appear on the NESI survey, and we created a scale, a proxy, saying no more than that. It's just some indicator. And again, you can see that, I hope you're reading some of the stuff, you know, trying to understand the strengths and weaknesses of your own views. I mean, how important is that to reasoning and ethical decision making? Trying to understand somebody else's views, actually changing your mind because of something you've learned and reflected and ruminated on. All of these things, I think, are signals of the kind of person that Chick was arguing we need to be thinking about today. Now, wait a second, I missed something here. Just to be sure all this stuff doesn't sound as sweet and neat as I'm making it sound, yeah, we have these general effects, but we also are understanding much more now about conditional effects. That is, some experiences and activities have a greater positive effect on certain students than others. So there are these conditional effects. I'm not going to talk much about this unless, well, I could do it over the noon hour, I guess. We got time over the noon hour. And then we're now discovering in different research centers these things we're calling compensatory effects, meaning there are certain kinds of activities that when certain groups of students do them, they actually get a boost to their performance. They actually begin to perform better than you would expect relative to some pre-existing condition, like our favorite ACT or SAT score, for example. Or we can predict whether students are more or less likely to graduate from a certain institution. And we've gotten some fairly promising findings, not just out of the Wabash National Study, but the NESE data here as well. And then some of these practices, and we've already begun to talk about them in terms of service learning and so on, they have unusually positive effects, it looks like, across the board for everybody who does them, even sometimes folks who didn't want to do them in the first place, but find themselves stuck. And part of this is peer effect, part of it is instructor design, being much more effective in terms of using these good teaching practices. Well, character development, I guess that's why we're here, right? And by now some of you have Googled wither and you'll be able to answer that question, what wither means. But let's also keep in mind some additional complications of what we've learned for 50, 60, 70 years. Some students show up more predisposed to do certain things and to benefit in certain ways than others. We can ask them about this on the way in, and knowing this perhaps gives us more accurate measures of what the impact of college is. And over the course of thousands of studies, this was, at least to my knowledge, first pointed out in the 60s by Ken Feldman, Ted Newcomb. Generally speaking, what you see are accentuation effects, meaning that what college really does is moves people further in the directions that they were already predisposed to move in, which is a huge challenge for us if you're talking about personal transformation. Because if you got folks who don't want to go there, it's pretty hard to get them to go there. And there are only a few things that are stuck in my mind, and so I repeat them everywhere I go. I was thinking about the Berkeley studies back from the 1960s and early 70s, where they were doing longitudinal work using instruments that we no longer use today, something called like the Omnibus Personality Inventory, right? It has a masculinity-femininity scale, which we could never use today, but it had a lot of other very desirable scales, and their estimate was, even though we talk so much about college being a potentially transforming experience, in the way in which they were organizing and analyzing the data, they estimated at best about 10% of college students really had this so-called personality reorganization that put them on a very different path toward human development. Anyway, it's just pretty complicated stuff, I guess, is what I'm saying. And we may not be surprised then, the more we understand about how complicated it is, why we don't necessarily get these kinds of linear positive effects all the time, even though some of the things we're doing make sense. So back to the definition of character, and I want to just unpack this a little bit and show a little bit of data that will surprise probably nobody in the room, but it's all I have to talk about. So this is what you get. So if we flesh out this idea of character development and the measures that we have limited, that I have access to, understanding oneself and understanding others, this kind of overall general knowledge of the world and how it works, and certainly this piece of ethical development, responsibility to the welfare, the civic good, and this idea of spirituality, which I suspect we'll hear more about. I hope we'll hear more about later today. You put these things together, knowledge of self. I guess I've already pretty much gone through this, so I won't. You can read it as well as I can. This is probably the weakest measure we have, so let's move quickly to the ethical development one. And we're asking students, in this instance, we're asking students here, to what extent have you made progress as a result of attending this college in these areas? So these are self-report data. We don't have any observational corroboration or confirmation of this. So we simply ask students to answer these questions.